The late afternoon sun hung low over the sleepy streets of Tall Pines, Alabama, casting long golden shadows over the red brick buildings. John Mitchell adjusted the rearview mirror of his Lincoln Continental, the engine humming beneath him as he eased onto Oakwood Drive. It had been a long day at the office, and he was ready to settle into a quiet evening at home, maybe even pour himself a glass of bourbon and listen to a little Coltrane on vinyl. But fate had other plans. Just as he slowed for a yellow light, the unmistakable flash of blue and red lights erupted in his rearview mirror. The wail of a siren cut through the late summer air like a knife. John frowned, his grip tightening slightly on the steering wheel. He knew he had done nothing wrong. With a slow exhale, he pulled to the side of the road, rolled down his window, and waited. The officer approached with the swagger of a man accustomed to authority. He was young, early 30s maybe, tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp, his belt heavy with the tools of his trade. The nameplate on his chest read, Officer Ryan Calloway. "License and registration," Calloway said, his tone flat, professional, but edged with something else, something sharper. John nodded and reached for the glove compartment, his movements deliberate. He had been here before, too many times. As he handed over his documents, Calloway studied him, his gaze lingering a beat too long. "You from around here?" he asked, flipping over the license. John met his eyes calmly. "Been living here for a few years now. My address is on the license." Calloway's expression didn't change. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" "Just going home." "You didn't come to a full stop at that light." John raised an eyebrow. "I slowed down, but if you say I didn't stop completely, I understand." For a moment, Calloway just looked at him. Something in his demeanor shifted. It was no longer a routine traffic stop. John could see it in the way the officer squared his shoulders, in the way his eyes flickered with something close to suspicion, or was it expectation? "Step out of the car for me," Calloway ordered. John held his gaze steady. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" A slow smirk ghosted across Calloway's lips. "I asked you to step out of the car." The unspoken threat hovered between them, but John remained still. He had spent a lifetime navigating moments like these. He had learned to master his expression, to keep his voice even, to never, ever let his temper get the best of him. Finally, he nodded and pushed open the door. Standing next to his car, the late-day sun casting an amber glow over them, he could feel Calloway sizing him up. John's neatly tailored suit and polished shoes didn't seem to fit whatever profile the officer had in his mind, and that perhaps made him more suspicious. "Hands on the hood." John complied. The officer patted him down, his movements rougher than necessary. It was a power play, an attempt to elicit a reaction, but John gave him nothing. When the search turned up nothing, Calloway took a step back, frustration flickering across his face. "You seem awfully comfortable with this process," he muttered. John straightened, brushing off the front of his jacket. "I believe in knowing my rights." Calloway's jaw tightened. "Are you a lawyer or something?" John smiled faintly. "Something like that." The vagueness seemed to irk Calloway even more. He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" John's smile faded. "I think fairness should apply to everyone, officer, including me." That did it. The mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing something darker underneath. "People like you always—" Calloway caught himself, but the damage was done. John tilted his head slightly. People like me. His voice was soft, but his words landed like a hammer. A heavy silence stretched between them. Calloway took a step back as if realizing he had just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "You know what? I don't care who you are," Calloway snapped, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. John reached into his inside pocket. Slowly, deliberately. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said, watching as Calloway's hand twitched toward his holster. A second later, John flipped open his leather wallet, revealing the gleaming shield inside. "John Mitchell," he said evenly, "Director of Internal Affairs, Alabama State Police." Calloway's face drained of color. His lips parted, but no sound came out. His eyes flicked between the badge and John's face, as if hoping this was some sort of elaborate trick. It wasn't. "I oversee officer conduct across the state," John continued, his voice measured, deliberate, "and I make sure the people who wear this badge do so with integrity." Calloway swallowed hard, shifting his weight. "Sir, John held up a hand. "Number you, listen now." He took a step forward, watching as the officer instinctively stepped back. "D." John held up a hand. "Number you, listen now." He took a step forward, watching as the officer instinctively stepped back. "Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been?" Calloway didn't answer. He looked like a man who had just realized he had walked into quicksand and had no idea how to escape. "It's not just the profiling," John said. "It's the fact that you never even considered that I might know my rights, that I might understand the law you swore to uphold. You assumed I was just another man you could intimidate, and that is a problem." Calloway swallowed hard, his shoulders sagging slightly. The weight of the moment was pressing down on him now. John took a step back and let the silence stretch before speaking again. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to return my documents, and you're going to think very carefully about what you say next." Calloway hesitated, then reached into his pocket with a shaky hand and pulled out John's license and registration. He handed them over without a word. John took them, tucked them back into his wallet, and turned toward his car. Then, just before getting in, he looked back over his shoulder. "Remember this, Officer Calloway," he said, his voice calm but firm. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." As John slid behind the wheel and pulled away, Calloway stood frozen on the pavement, staring after him, his confidence shaken, his future uncertain. But for John, this was far from over. The next morning, John sat in his office at the Alabama State Police headquarters. A file lay open before him. Calloway's name was printed at the top. A pattern of complaints stretched back years. Excessive stops, vague misconduct, reports that had been brushed aside. John leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he considered the bigger picture. Calloway wasn't just one bad officer. He was a symptom of a deeper problem, and John wasn't interested in putting a bandage on a bullet wound. Later that week, he sat across from the state police chief in a conference room. "We don't just need to discipline bad officers," he said. "We need to change the culture that protects them." The chief rubbed his temples. "This is going to ruffle some feathers." John nodded. "Good, it's about time someone did."